Psychological dynamics of unconscious shadow projection, pattern recognition, shadow integration, and strategic perception. Introduction. Human perception and behavior are shaped by a complex interplay of conscious and unconscious psychological processes. The dimensions of unconscious shadow projection, pattern recognition, shadow integration, and strategic perception provide a framework for understanding how internal conflicts, emotional biases, and cognitive patterns influence the way individuals interpret the world. Drawing from analytical psychology and classical conditioning models, these processes reveal not only how humans project and perceive external reality, but also how those perceptions can be subtly influenced by environmental, technological, and social factors. Examining these dynamics illuminates both the potential for personal growth through self-awareness and the mechanisms by which external forces, including media and AI-driven surveillance, can manipulate cognition and behavior. Analytical psychology. Analytical psychology is a psychological framework founded by Carl Gustav Jung that emphasizes the dynamic relationship between the conscious and unconscious aspects of the human mind. Unlike Freud's focus on repressed sexuality and childhood experience, Jung proposed that the psyche strives for balance and wholeness through the process of individuation, the integration of all parts of the self, including those that are hidden or repressed. Central to this theory are concepts such as the collective unconscious, which contains universal archetypes and symbols shared across humanity, and the shadow, representing the disowned or denied elements of personality. Analytical psychology views dreams, myths, and symbols as pathways to understanding the unconscious, encouraging individuals to engage with their inner world to achieve greater psychological harmony and self-realization. The Pavlovian framework. The Pavlovian framework, also known as classical conditioning, is a psychological model developed by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov in the early 20th century. It explains how associative learning occurs when a neutral stimulus becomes linked with a meaningful one, eventually triggering the same response on its own. Pavlov demonstrated this by pairing the sound of a bell, a neutral stimulus, with the presentation of food, a natural stimulus, to dogs. After repeated pairings, the dogs began to salivate at the sound of the bell alone. This framework reveals how the human mind can form automatic emotional and physiological reactions to stimuli through repetition and association. Beyond its use in behavioral psychology, the Pavlovian framework has been applied in advertising, education, politics, and media, where words, sounds, symbols, or images are repeatedly linked with specific emotions, values, or identities, shaping perception and behavior often without conscious awareness. Unconscious shadow projection. Unconscious shadow projection originates in analytical psychology, particularly in the work of Carl Gustav Jung. It refers to the process by which individuals attribute their repressed or unacknowledged traits, emotions, or desires onto others. The shadow represents aspects of the psyche that the conscious ego does not identify with, often impulses, weaknesses, or socially unacceptable characteristics. Because these elements are unconscious, individuals often perceive them externally, interpreting them as flaws or threats in other people or situations. From a psychological perspective, projection functions as a defense mechanism, reducing internal conflict by externalizing disowned traits. However, persistent projection can distort interpersonal perception and hinder self-awareness, leading to misunderstandings, conflict, or moral superiority. Contemporary psychotherapy views awareness of projection as critical for personal growth and emotional regulation. Pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is a fundamental cognitive process by which the brain detects regularities and structures in sensory input. It allows humans to identify faces, interpret language, detect threats, and anticipate outcomes based on learned experiences. In both psychology and neuroscience, pattern recognition is associated with perceptual organization, memory, and predictive processing. While this ability is essential for survival and efficient decision-making, it can also produce cognitive distortions. The human mind tends to perceive patterns even in random data, a phenomenon known as apophenia or pareidolia. This tendency links closely with projection, as individuals may unconsciously interpret external stimuli through the filter of internal biases or unresolved emotional content. In this way, pattern recognition operates as both a rational and an emotional process, influenced by memory, expectation, and belief. Shadow integration. Shadow integration involves recognizing, accepting, and assimilating the unconscious aspects of the psyche into conscious awareness. In Jungian terms, this process aims to achieve psychological wholeness, known as individuation, through reflection, dialogue, or therapeutic methods, such as active imagination. Individuals learn to confront their projections and reclaim repressed traits as part of their own identity. Psychologically, integration reduces internal conflict and defensive behavior, improving authenticity, empathy, and self-regulation. It encourages emotional resilience by transforming projected hostility or fear into self-understanding. The process is neither purely intellectual nor moral, rather, it is experiential, requiring self-honesty and tolerance of inner contradiction. Strategic perception. Strategic perception refers to the deliberate use of awareness, interpretation, and foresight in perceiving oneself and others. It involves consciously managing perception to improve understanding, anticipate behavior, and make balanced judgments. Unlike unconscious projection or reflexive pattern recognition, strategic perception relies on metacognition, the ability to observe one's own thought processes. In applied psychology, strategic perception is valuable in leadership, negotiation, intelligence analysis, and interpersonal dynamics. It integrates cognitive accuracy with emotional insight, emphasizing perspective taking and situational adaptability. When informed by shadow integration, strategic perception allows individuals to discern genuine patterns from projections, interpret motivations more accurately, and respond with empathy rather than reactivity. Ultimately, it represents the maturation of perception from instinctive reaction to conscious strategy, linking self-awareness with intelligent action in complex social environments. The transformation of projection into strategic social perception. The same psychological capacities that give rise to projection, pattern recognition, and emotional sensitivity can evolve into strategic social perception once the shadow is integrated. Initially, these faculties operate unconsciously. Projection externalizes inner conflicts, pattern recognition detects perceived meanings or threats, and emotional sensitivity amplifies one's reactions to them. When the shadow remains unacknowledged, these abilities distort perception, causing one to see personal fears or desires reflected in others. Through shadow integration, however, the individual becomes aware of these internal dynamics and learns to distinguish between subjective projection and objective observation. The once reactive emotional and cognitive patterns are refined into tools of insight, allowing a person to perceive motives, relationships, and social currents with clarity and balance. Thus, what once fueled distortion becomes the foundation of authentic empathy, discernment, and intelligent social strategy. Psychological manipulation through media and the unconscious. The media we consume, whether music, film, news, or social platforms, can be psychologically engineered to shape beliefs and emotional responses through mechanisms described in analytical psychology and behavioral conditioning. By appealing to the unconscious, media can engage the shadow, the hidden aspects of the psyche that hold both repressed fears and unacknowledged desires. When symbols, archetypes, or narratives are repeatedly presented, they resonate with these unconscious contents, creating projection. We see elements of ourselves in the portrayed enemy or ideal. Through the Pavlovian framework, repetition and emotional reinforcement link certain images, sounds, phrases, or even numbers with feelings of safety or threat, producing conditioned associations that bypass rational thought. Over time, this symbolic conditioning can subtly reverse one's emotional orientation toward an idea or group, making what was once perceived as threatening seem familiar, and thus acceptable. Because the subconscious does not distinguish between external influence and inner truth, the continual exposure to archetypal patterns and emotionally charged symbols in media can reprogram perception itself, without shadow integration. The conscious recognition of one's own projections and emotional triggers, individuals remain vulnerable to this form of psychological manipulation, mistaking external narratives for genuine personal conviction. Psychological and environmental control in a dystopia. Governmental organizations set up by a mixture of public and secretive Judaic groups with globalist authoritarian messianic ambitions are using applied psychology and classical conditioning to manage and suppress independent thought. By controlling information, shaping emotional associations, and creating predictable behavioral responses, artificial intelligence systems are gradually conditioning citizens to comply with narratives set by these globalist governmental organizations. This psychological manipulation is being compounded by environmental and technological factors that dull critical reasoning and heighten dependency on authority, such as chemicals in the water, such as the neurotoxin fluoride to lower IQ. Also the neurotoxin mercury that affects nearly every system in the body, with toxicity primarily targeting the nervous system and immune system, while also disrupting hormonal balance and reproductive health. Neurologically, exposure can cause memory loss, difficulty concentrating, mood swings, headaches, sleep disturbances, and sensory impairments. Immune and endocrine disruption trigger autoimmune reactions or thyroid and hormonal imbalances, indirectly affecting metabolism, energy, and sexual function. Mercury also impacts reproductive health. In men, it can lower sperm count, reduce motility, decrease testosterone levels, and impair libido and sexual performance, while in women, it can cause menstrual irregularities and disrupt ovarian function. Prenatal exposure poses additional risks, potentially harming fetal neurological and reproductive development. Some animal studies have observed changes in sexual behavior following mercury exposure, such as an increase in homosexual activity. Certain chemicals used in agriculture, particularly pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, have been shown to affect the human brain. These compounds are designed to disrupt biological processes in pests, but many also interact with human nervous systems, especially with chronic. Some pesticides have neurotoxic effects, such as organophosphate and carbamates, inhibit acetylcholinesterase, an enzyme critical for proper nerve signal transmission. This can lead to symptoms ranging from headaches, dizziness, and memory problems to severe neurological dysfunction. Chronic low-level exposure has been linked in some studies to cognitive decline, attention deficits, and mood disorders. Exposure during pregnancy or early childhood is particularly concerning because the developing brain is highly sensitive. Studies suggest links between prenatal pesticide exposure and reduced IQ, learning difficulties, and behavioral problems in children. Pesticides can also contribute to oxidative stress and inflammation in the body, which indirectly affect brain function. Certain compounds may disrupt hormonal systems, endocrine disruptors, interfering with neurotransmitter balance and cognitive processes. Neurological interventions that come from geoengineering, involving very fine, soluble aluminum compounds that, if ingested or inhaled, can enter the bloodstream and accumulate in the brain, potentially leading to neurological effects such as memory problems or cognitive decline. The United Kingdom's Saturn experienced 𝗧𝗍𝗲𝗱𝗏, which can cause irritation of the nose, throat, and airways, as well as coughing, wheezing, and shortness of breath, and can exacerbate asthma and chronic bronchitis. It can also trigger inflammation and oxidative stress, potentially increasing the risk of cardiovascular problems in susceptible individuals, and at high concentrations may reduce oxygen delivery to tissues, indirectly affecting organ function, while direct effects on memory and cognition are not well documented in healthy humans at environmental exposure levels. Some studies suggest that chronic exposure to air pollution, including sulfur dioxide, may contribute to cognitive decline indirectly through inflammation, oxidative stress, or reduced oxygenation of brain tissue. Short-term exposure can also cause headaches, fatigue, or difficulty concentrating, temporarily impairing cognitive performance. Constant exposure to radio frequency signals, such as those from cell phones, Wi-Fi, and other wireless technologies, has been widely studied for potential effects on the human body and brain. Radio signals are a form of non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation, meaning they do not have enough energy to directly damage DNA like X-rays or gamma rays. However, concerns have focused on thermal and non-thermal biological effects that could result from prolonged exposure. Some studies suggest that extended exposure to RF signals may affect brain activity, particularly in areas associated with attention, memory, and sleep regulation. AI governance and AI-powered digital ID surveillance can be used to systematically monitor, analyze, and influence human behavior on an unprecedented scale. By tracking individual interactions with media, communications, and online activity, AI systems can identify psychological vulnerabilities, such as unconscious biases, emotional triggers, and behavioral patterns, combined with insights from analytical psychology and behavioral conditioning. This data can inform the design and dissemination of media content, music, films, news, or social media that subtly reinforces specific narratives or emotional responses. Through repeated exposure to carefully curated symbols, archetypes, phrases, or imagery, AI-assisted media can engage the shadow, the unconscious part of the psyche, triggering projection and emotional associations that bypass conscious reasoning. Using principles similar to the Pavlovian framework, AI can reinforce conditioned responses, linking certain ideas or groups with feelings of safety, threat, or moral approval, gradually shaping perception and belief systems. Digital ID surveillance amplifies this effect by enabling hyper-personalization. Media and information can be delivered precisely to the individuals most susceptible to particular narratives, while their responses are continuously monitored and fed back into the system. Over time, this creates a feedback loop in which the subconscious mind absorbs repeated associations, subtly modifying cognition, emotional orientation, and social behavior. In this way, AI governance and digital surveillance can function as powerful tools for shaping perception, controlling narratives, and influencing collective thought patterns, especially in populations lacking awareness of their own psychological projections and triggers. Within such a scenario, the population's cognitive freedom shrinks until individuals effectively live in an invisible psychological prison, responding reflexively to cues rather than exercising independent judgment. This concept serves as a cautionary reflection on how behavioral science and technology, when misused, undermines autonomy and free will. Conclusion: the four psychological dimensions, unconscious shadow projection, pattern recognition, shadow integration, and strategic perception, form a continuum from reflexive, unconscious processes to deliberate, conscious mastery of perception. Initially, humans externalize their inner conflicts and project them onto the environment, while pattern recognition and emotional sensitivity shape responses to perceived threats or opportunities. Through shadow integration, these reactive tendencies can be understood and assimilated, allowing emotional and cognitive patterns to transform into tools of insight. Finally, strategic perception enables deliberate, informed interpretation of oneself and others, fostering empathy, discernment, and adaptive decision-making. Understanding this progression only enhances individual psychological development, but also sheds light on how perception, when influenced or manipulated, can be shaped on a collective level, underscoring the importance of awareness, autonomy, and critical engagement with external stimuli.